Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. My name's Rob, and today we're talking with Professor Emeritus at San Jose State University, Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. Dr. Weiss, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you're also a board member of the National Association of Scholars, and wanted to shout that out as well. But first and foremost, how do you take your coffee?
I take it black with just a splash of milk, whole milk preferably, but not cream.
What's your story? Give us a little biography and what got you interested in anthropology.
So I'm what we used to call a physical anthropologist. Sometimes you'll sometimes hear it called a biological anthropologist now. And basically, my area of research has been looking at the skeletal remains of past peoples who died, sometimes hundreds of years ago, sometimes thousands of years ago, and trying to reconstruct their lives. So that might be looking at disease patterns or trauma patterns. And I've done this for now over 2 decades. And one of the reasons why I was attracted to physical anthropology is because I love anatomy, and especially skeletal anatomy. I think that the skeleton is a beautiful thing, actually, because it shows form and function, but it is also the only part of the body that regularly is left behind that can help us reconstruct the past and tell stories about people who died before before there was even a written language. So I've always loved anatomy as long as I can remember. Even as a child, I would like those anatomy toys like rebuilding the eye or the visible woman, where it's like a model of a woman with all the body parts and you can make her pregnant or not by putting the little fetus in the body. And I just love anatomy and what it can tell us about ourselves, from the variation from disease to health, but also from, how things have changed from hundreds or thousands of years ago to now, and what has stayed the same. And so, like, one of my previous books that came out, I believe in 2017, was called Reading the Bones, Activity, Biology, and Culture, that looked at each type of trait that we look at bones and try to figure out what is determined or what causes these types of traits. Is it something we did, activity patterns like grinding acorns makes big deltoid tuberosities on the humerus? Or is it something that is biological, like sex differences? Or something that's cultural, like the wear that we sometimes see on people's teeth from running twine or things through their teeth to make threads? And so I just think it's fascinating what skeletal remains can tell us.
And we're going to take a short break to hear a word from a sponsor, Seville Handyman Services. They serve the entire Charlottesville area, taking care of hundreds of needs around the home and office. Everyday repairs of all kinds, installation of innumerable types of household fixtures, handrails, door locks, lights and fans, baby proofing, etc., furniture assembly, minor painting, screen and installation repair, picture hanging, and hundreds of other jobs too numerous to list. All of their work is performed honestly, responsibly, and conscientiously, and comes with a personal emailed report at the end of the day noting everything they did, along with relevant details, comments, and useful suggestions for the customer. Their rate is $45 an hour. Call or email Chris anytime to see how he can help you. Details in the show notes. You mentioned some things that have changed and some things have stayed the same in skeletal remains over the years. What are some of the primary markers of stability versus change in skeletal remains that you've seen?
One of the things I've looked at quite often is osteoarthritis, or what we know as degenerative joint disease. Most people will get it if they live old enough. And if you look at the arthritis patterns over time and in different peoples, what you see is that regardless of what population you look at, modern, ancient, or even non-human animals, arthritis is prevalent in almost every bone collection you will look at. And you could see it on the joint surfaces. It's like you'll either see like a shiny surface, what we call eburnation, so it looks like polished because it's bone on bone rubbing and gives you a nice polish, or porosity, so little holes in the joint, or a lipping, a increase in bone surface around that joint. So there's those three indicators. But even though it's so universal, there are patterns that tell us things that how our lives have changed. For example, in some of the collections I looked at that are prehistoric or pre-contact California Amerindians, so we're talking about 2,000-3,000 years ago, almost all of the arthritis is either in the backbones or in the arm bones. This is likely related to all of their hunting and gathering activities, both in males and females, like spear throwing, for example, or processing hides. Whereas if you look at modern Americans, for example, you'll find that they have very little arthritis of the upper arms, but lots of knee arthritis, some hand arthritis, but lots of knee arthritis and hip arthritis that's related to our excess body weight now. So you have these kind of patterns that you can help people understand what's going on with their bodies, what has changed, what is biological. So one of the best indicators of whether you have this bone disease or not, this bone and joint disease or not, is your age. And so what's surprising is that even though in some ways we've done ourselves bad by gaining too much weight and that affects our knees, we still get arthritis about 10 years later than most prehistoric populations. So you'll see like individuals who are likely 30 to 40 having what looks like joints of a 50-year-old. And so that's another interesting aspect. And
Is that just
so
modern
much.
medicine and better, more available food, or is that just maybe the facet of someone on a micro or lower level evolutionary type function?
It's probably just because they worked so much harder that they were working their joints to a much greater extent. The other thing is that you can get arthritis from injuries. And so like if you throw out your shoulder as a young person, like let's say as playing sports in your teens, this can have an effect decades later as shoulder arthritis, the humerus and scapula joint, the glenohumeral joint. So you basically have people were likely facing higher rates of injuries, and this led to arthritis later on in life.
Why don't you walk us through now, thankfully, more in the past controversy, but something that put you on my radar that you were involved with, I think probably from 2021 through just at the close of 2024. But why don't you give us a little walkthrough
Right.
of what you've written a book about it, you've written several articles, but give our listeners a little primer of that.
So basically, I started my job at San Jose State University as a professor in 2004. And around 2018, I wrote a book with now retired attorney James W. Springer called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. And what repatriation is what it's supposed to be, at least, is the giving back of skeletal remains to descendant communities. So where there's a clear link between the past population and the modern population. However, this act has gone off the rails, and repatriation is now basically the act of giving bones and artifacts of ancient people to almost anyone who claims them. And the work to make real ties has been ignored, for example. And so Jim and I wrote a book called Repatriation and Erasing the Past, set to come out in 2020 to come out at the 30th anniversary of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So I've always been against repatriating bones because I think they're so interesting to study. And I understand that people disagree with me on this to a certain extent, but my position has not changed. I think that we really need to move towards a culture or belief systems where we can practice our beliefs, whatever they may be, but still enjoy the benefits of science and the scientific study of skeletal remains. And so Jim and I wrote this book. What we talked about in the book is how repatriation is not just the physical act of returning bones, but also that it's part of a greater identity politics issue where the repatriation ideology is one of like a postmodern perspective of splitting the anthropological world in this case into two groups, the victims or the oppressed and the victimizers or the oppressors. And that in this postmodern perspective, there's no such thing as truth. Basically, what you're just saying is if you are one of the victims, then your word has to be taken as fact. You are one of the victimizers, you have to be ignored. So basically, what we have is this kind of ideology that ignores objective truths or objective knowledge that you can gain from literally looking at the bones. And in its place is this kind of identity politics. When this book came out in 2020, there was a uproar. An open letter went out to my publisher, which then became an open letter, to have the book withdrawn. And so people were calling it racist because they were saying that it's anti-Indigenous, which it's not. It's just anti-postmodernist in a sense, anti-identity politics in favor of science or in favor of looking for an objective truth. About 800 or so people signed this open letter to try to get it, try to get the book banned. They wouldn't call it banning the book, but they wanted it pulled from publication. They didn't want it in any libraries. Fortunately, a retired attorney, he basically told the publishers that if they do take it off, they would be breaching the contract we signed, and there would be consequences to that. So they didn't pull the book. But a cascading series of events happened after that. One of which happened, some of which happened at my university, including the chair of my department basically holding a session calling me a racist and a scientific doing scientific racism, and saying that he would try to take me out of my classrooms. But also, I wrote an op-ed in the San Jose Mercury News against the California version of NAGPRA called CalNAGPRA, and that led my university to up their attacks against me, so to speak. I also published a photograph on Twitter with me holding a skull, a very common act that was never considered something that was inappropriate at the time. Smithsonian had lots of photos like that. Most universities did. My own university used to sometimes ask me to pose with photos of skeletal remains. At this point in 2020, 2021, they basically said that this was kind of like a horrendous thing to do and violent, and the university basically locked me out of the curation facility. They locked me out of the curation facility, and I hired Pacific Legal Foundation to represent me, and so I sued my university. Since then, I've written a book about all of these things and more, putting not only the details of my case in writing, but also looking at academic environment in general and anthropology in specific. And that book, which came out in June 2024, is On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors.
We're going to do a little intro here before we jump into more detailed questions about that. But how do you define the sex binary?
The sex binary is the biological concept of sex that and that there are males and females. That's there's only the two. And we can look at male and female differences in the skeleton, and we can identify it, looking at the pelvis is the main difference between males and females, because females' pelvises have changed it a viable anatomical trait for childbirth, especially large brained babies like humans have. But it's not just the pelvis. It's the skull has differences, such as jaw differences in shape of the front of the jaw. Males is much more square with a triangular area in the center. The brow difference.
What about males' jaws? Why is that possibly a little bit more square and triangular? Is that just because they're maybe eating more meat? Like, what's the kind of
it's
evolutionary theory behind that?
it's driven by testosterone. And so it does not matter. One of the things we find is that all of these sex differences that we find in the skeleton doesn't differ between one population and another. So you could compare all populations and they have these same sex differences. And then the other thing is that it doesn't change through time. So from the beginning of Homo sapiens to now, you find the same sex differences. Once we get big brain babies, the pelvic differences are there, for example. And so a lot of this is driven by testosterone for the males and estrogen for the females. And so what we find in this whole skeleton is that when bone is remodeled, so many people would look at a bone and they think of it as kind of this static thing, but bone is ever changing when we're living, of course, with growth, but then later on, even as we age, bone turns over to repair, but also just to maintain. And what we find in adults is that with females, the bone is remodeled more on the inside next to the medullary cavity, or what you would think of as the marrow. On long bones and it is especially prominent on long bones, I should say. And on males, the remodeling and the maintenance is on the outside, what we call the periosteum. So the endosteum is on the inside, the periosteum is on the outside. And what this results in is that the male skeleton is much more robust. So if you take a cross section of any bone, let's say the humerus, the upper arm bone, you'll see that the cross section of males is more rugged, so less evenly shaped and bigger, as opposed to the female. And so this is driven by our sex hormones. And so we get a more gracile build of females and a more robust or rugged build of the male skeleton. What's interesting about this is that it affects the whole skeleton, not just the pelvis, not just the limb bones, but we see these kinds of difference throughout the whole skeleton. And they become prominent after puberty. So one of the interesting things about looking at skeletal remains is that you cannot tell the difference between male and female very well with bones before puberty. There's a little bit of size difference, and there's a difference in maturation rate. So for example, females and their growth earlier than males. But the only consistent way to find differences between males and females in young individuals, so prepubescent individuals, is by looking at their DNA, by actually looking at their chromosomal makeup.
How often are you able to extract DNA from the bones that you were studying? I know, like, obviously
Right.
the older it is, the harder it is, but how often? Give us a rough estimate. How often could you actually find workable DNA markers in male versus female?
From the collections I study probably 100%. So, and the oldest, and I've studied many collections, but the main collection I studied, the oldest age was about 3,000 years old. And these were California Amerindians, so from California pre-contact, and you probably could always get DNA from them. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that you could get DNA from every single individual, but given a sample, you could get DNA, you know, and the DNA to examine the sex differences is doesn't have to be as well preserved as DNA for some other types of research, for example. So that's
Would
another
you
aspect.
primarily be getting it from like the marrow and the leg bone, or are you actually able to get it off the bone because it's still a bone and it hasn't become fossilized yet?
You'd get one of the things is because many skeletal remains, including the one I studied, the main one I studied, had been handled by many people before DNA was even known to be still in the bones, for example. So the earliest excavation was in the 60s. So the collection that I studied, the Ryan Mound, it had been handled probably by hundreds of people before me. um, so you wouldn't want to get the DNA off of an area where it had been handled. So you'd either go into the bone and take a small sample, or there are two other places that are very good for DNA. One is in a tooth. So you cut open a tooth and you scrape out the dentin, and there's DNA. And that is, teeth are extremely hard. It's the hardest part of the body. It's one of the hardest natural parts, natural properties is enamel. So in a sense, that's always a good way to get DNA if you can get it through the tooth. You crack it open, you go to the dentin or to the pulp and get your DNA. The other part is there's a really hard part of the skull, the mastoid, that's right behind your ear. And that is almost always intact, and going into that and getting bone that's in there usually has pristine DNA. So those are the two main parts. But it's interesting. Some people say, well, why not just always test DNA instead of looking at skeletal traits to determine whether someone was a male or female? DNA is destructive. You have to grind up whatever sample you take to get it. But it's also more expensive and it's more time consuming. If you give me a skeleton, I could tell you within 10 minutes whether that is most likely a male or a female. And depending on how complete the skeleton is, will depend on how sure I am to make my decision.
And it
And
sounds
that's
like
one,
also maybe the age, like if it's a prepubescent child versus a
right,
postpubescent adult or just older, more
exactly.
mature individual.
That's true too. It's like if it was prepubescent, I wouldn't necessarily want to venture a guess, but if it's an adult, absolutely easy to do. One of the interesting things is people who believe that sex is on a spectrum, they makes they have some what I would call fallacies that anthropologists used to understand and they seem to have forgotten. And that is, people point out chromosomal abnormalities where people don't just have the XY chromosome, but maybe have XX or XXY or XYY, or are missing a chromosome. And these individuals, obviously, they occur. It's a pathology. It's a chromosomal abnormality. And what's interesting about that is that they're still male or female. They just are. They just have a birth defect, and many of them, almost all of them, cannot have children themselves. And so to confuse this with normal variation, I think there's a real disservice to people who are facing these types of hardships. Like, let's say sometimes these people don't know they have chromosomal abnormality until they are trying to have children, or some of these chromosomal abnormalities will result in other problems such as bone bone disorders or rates of development. And so I think it does people a disservice to act like birth defects or pathologies are normal variation, because we're not helping those people. We're really just minimizing what they are going through and not trying to see how best to help them.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what.
We also I think part of that psychology, for lack of a better term, also comes from, so maybe eugenics in our past history, saying that okay, it's a birth defect, which means they need to be fixed. And yes, maybe they need to be fixed, but also there's lots of people with birth defects who just don't need to be fixed. And also the word defect also I can see can sometimes be
Right.
somewhat dehumanizing, and we don't want to do that. But we also have to acknowledge fundamental physical reality, like knowing how to put forth how to both honor the individual and also honor, and not only honor, but also just bear fruit from basic facts, right? Like,
Yeah, and I also think that in a sense, it doesn't, it doesn't do us any good service to act like the only way to treat birth defects, congenital defects as, oh, well, the eugenicists wanted to get rid of that, and therefore we have to be treated as these are just normal variants. I think what we really need to do is move towards a society or towards cultures where people who have birth defects are not moralized at all, that there's not a moral stigma or at all about it. And I think that when we understand these things, it's just, you could say it's just the luck of the draw sometimes. If we're in the, counseling service or medicine or whatever it is, help people to live the best lives that they can live without a stigma and without, attaching morality to perfection. And I think that that's an important point. Another aspect that anthropologists are doing is they, with the sex binary not versus sex spectrum, is that they are equating imperfection with being on the spectrum. So one of the things is that we find that some women, perfectly fine women, still have trouble having a normal birth. That might be because of their partners, of different sized partners. So a small woman with a very large man has a higher rate of a cesarean section. There's, it might just be, normal variation, but in a sense, we shouldn't act like there's only, if you're not a perfect female, you're not female, you're somewhere in between. That is not helpful, in the sense that, there's normal human variation, and then there is disease or pathology. And we shouldn't conflate either one of those with sex being on a spectrum, as opposed to understanding the biology and the body as accurately as possible without a moral stigma applied to making those decisions or making those classifications. And I would say the third fallacy is, like, when you are looking at bones and you're doing a sex identification, you're going to go, are you 100% sure it's female? So female, maybe female, unsure, maybe male, male. But that doesn't mean that there's these 5 genders. What it means is, how sure are you that you've been able to make that determination? If I just have one single bone, I may be very unsure and choose, that I'm not sure. I may be able to say with maybe male if I just have the jaw, but I might just still be like, I don't know 100%. I may not be very practiced at determining whether somebody is a male or female. This 5 scale point is not about the actual bones, but about our ability to assess those bones. And I think that that's another point, is that sometimes we can't identify whether an individual had been male or female because we just aren't perfect at doing these assessments.
You mentioned several times people have tried to reframe sex binary, sex on a spectrum. The way that I've heard it maybe a little bit more accurately phrased is sex is binary, but gender is on a spectrum. Gender being cultural attitudes towards sex, right? Like long hair for females, generally shorter hair for men. Generally, men are more stinky. They need to wear deodorant more. Deodorant, the deodorants for men tend to be like wood or charcoal, whereas deodorants for female tend to be flowers. Like those aren't inherently masculine or feminine or male or female, but they are masculine or feminine in our culture. Would you do you have problems with that identification, or do you think that's roughly okay, for lack of a better term?
I think that that's a good point. And, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in anthropology, we were told, and even when I was doing my master's, we were told not to use the term gender when we meant sex, when we meant the biological component. But I think that the lines have blurred, especially in colloquial speech. And not everybody agrees that gender does not mean biology. So if I'm writing a paper, I always use the term sex when I mean male, female, because gender in anthropological terms does mean that sex plus culture, for example. So I do think what's interesting is that even though a lot of these things are cultural, they are so widespread universals that I wonder how much of what we think is cultural still has a biological component. I've traveled not all over the world, but I've lived in Europe and traveled throughout Europe. I've also lived in Argentina for 3 months when I was a teenager. I've lived 1 year in Egypt. I spent 2 months in Kenya. And, so I've been in many places. What I think is interesting is that things like, the different types of smells for perfumes, it's the same in many places, that the female smells tend to be more floral and then the male smells. Egypt is a good example of that, where, they're very much into scents and perfumes and so forth. And it's still the same pattern, even though they are a different culture than us. So I wonder how much of that is cultural and how much is biological.
Or
And
even
that's one that,
pushing that one back. I know there's been several experiments run on chimpanzee kids
right?
where like they just put out trucks and dolls and stuff that we would
Yeah,
consider gendered, masculine or feminine, but male chimpanzee non-adults, like chimpanzee
yeah,
kids, the males prefer the trucks and the females prefer the dolls. Like they will females will like
yeah.
swaddle the dolls and the males will like crash the trucks together. Doesn't look much different than my two sons. So
Yeah,
yeah, all
I
such a
think
good
that
point.
that's a good point. And so it's kind of interesting to try to tease these things apart. And throughout my career, that's what I tried to do with bones, is try to tease what is biological, what is cultural, and what is individual or activity related, what happened in those people's lives from day to day, so to speak.
When you've been working in your field for over 20 years, it sounds like, when did you first notice this mission creep from yes, sex binary is needed for our work to this needs to be reevaluated in
You know,
some sense?
it's kind of interesting because obviously academia has been progressive for a long time. And even when I first started at the university, there were things that were like, I thought, oh my goodness, this is so politically correct. It's ridiculous. There was always still a little pushback from some people. There were always still some variations. And if you disagreed, it, you weren't turned into a villain. And it wasn't really until 2020 or 2019 that I think we saw a huge shift. Now, maybe it happened a couple of years earlier and I just didn't notice, but it wasn't, you know, in the 90s this bad in that sense. So when I was hired in 2004, basically I had very similar perspective to many things, whether it was repatriation, whether it was the sex binary, um, and everybody knew it. And everybody knew it for years. I was given great evaluations, and my chair would write things like, you know, Professor Weiss holds controversial viewpoints, but we think this is great to show diverse opinions and spark debate. To she is evil, you know, she needs to be removed from the classrooms. And so I think that it's actually a very recent thing. In some ways, that gives me hope that it can be turned back. But anthropology is different than most fields in the sense that we've lost so much in these culture wars already. The repatriating, the reburial of collections, the shuttering of museum exhibits, the censoring of journals, that I'm not sure that we can easily just turn the page, you know, and say, okay, we're back. You know, I don't think that that can happen when you've lost all your collections, as many universities have done. But I think that the line to be drawn, like with bones, actually, most of the bones that have in the U.S. that have a clear connection, like with historic documents to modern tribes, have been reburied or have been repatriated. And all the stuff that is now being done, there is no clear connection. And it's kind of interesting because when NAGPRA was first passed, they thought, and I say they as an anthropologists and archaeologists, thought this was a good compromise. We're going to give back the remains that where there's a clear connection, and we're going to keep that which is not and continue on. And the compromise has failed, in part because, you know, the Repatriation Act is being driven by activists who want to deny certain claims or certain information that we can get, such as, you know, the level of violence that was in pre-contact America, the level of disease that was in pre-contact America, and the evidence of slavery that was in pre-contact America. So, but the other thing is, you know, I don't think we really want to be in a world where there's no museums that are what we call encyclopedic museums. So when you go to a museum, there's kind of two types of museums. There's what we call the encyclopedic museums that exhibit things from around the world. And then there are museums that are local that exhibit things from that area. And both have their place. Museums are a place where children, for example, who may not get the opportunity to travel around the world will learn about the world around them in a way that's really tangible, exciting, sparking their curiosity and imagination. And so we don't want to, you know, say, well, you know, if this artifact is from Africa, from Kenya, and it's housed in New York, we want to put it back to Kenya. We don't want everything like that. And vice versa. Kenya should have some things that are not Kenyan. So I do think that that's an important, you know, fact. But I also think that this kind of retroactive repatriation is doing more harm than good. We can say from now on, if there's a skeleton to be had, let's ensure that people in most places are aware that sometimes skeletal remains are useful for study, and have people consider that before they die. We do that with organ donations. So one of the amazing things is how much we've moved in the direction of almost everybody saying, yes, I want to be an organ donator if I die, and my organs can be can be utilized to save a life. To, you know, a world maybe only 50 years ago where almost nobody wanted that. So I do think that this is kind of a cultural phenomenon that can be pursued in a way, not to force people into this, but to convince them that this is actually a great thing that you could do. And some of the forensic collections that are continuing that do take now only consent bodies where consent has been signed have even processes where you can donate your organs, and then after those organs are donated, the skeleton can be used for collection and for research. So I think that that should be the direction that we should hope for.
Mentioned several times activists, and maybe our listeners might be a little bit more familiar with the term woke or DEI, as much as I don't like those because they're problematic in their own definitional sense, but they're a good cultural touch point. Seems those three words seem to be at the center of your controversy and what we've been talking about. Do you think this type of ideology in general is why Americans have lost trust in academia over the past 10, 15 years?
Yes, I do think that this is a large part of it. And it's not just in the US, it's also in the UK, for example, Australia, Canada, Germany. It is at least a Western phenomena. I'm not so sure about beyond the West.
We're talking in our country's third week with Trump with Donald Trump as our president for a second time around. Do you think with his ascendancy back to the presidency that, for lack of a better term again, that cultural wokeness has not only peaked, but is kind of like on the decline? You seem to be pretty pessimistic about anthropology specifically, but do you think in a more cultural, either through the larger academic state or even especially to the larger political state of the US, do you think wokeness is on the retreat, decline, one or two of those adjectives?
It's so hard to say. I do think that in some areas wokeness is on the decline. And academia, I'm not so sure. I wonder if there's going to be a lot of doubling down. um, I just
One, one,
recently,
one would hope that there are lessons learned from the past few years. I specifically think of Oberlin College having to pay some $40 million to that supermarket that
Mhm.
admin of that school, private liberal research institution, had to pay to the grocer. And there's
Yeah,
also at public schools, right? There's board of trustees, and those are often politically appointed. So maybe not. I'm not sure how California
yeah,
system worked, but there's also tenure and entrenched bureaucracy to deal with.
yeah. And in anthropology, there's still a lot of censorship and it's still increasing. I have a feeling that even if some of the laws were removed, like let's say NAGPRA was repealed, and it would be a joyous occasion for me. I'm not sure that that would change the minds of the anthropologists in the universities or museums. And I think that they would just continue to repatriate and rebury things. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're all kind of, maybe there's a secret cohort of them waiting for it to happen, and then they would come out of their closets. But I'm just not so sure about that. And I do wonder if some doubling down is going to occur in academia.
Do you see yourself ever going back into academia or higher ed work, especially on the teaching or research level? Do you see that as a pathway at all in the next few years or even decade?
I don't see myself going back to teaching. I am continuing to do research, and I hope to be able to continue to do research for a while to come. Um, One of the things is that because many of the journals have become so politicized, many of the anthropology journals have become so politicized that I don't think I'll be able to publish in those journals. But so far, I've been having I've still been able to publish, for example, in medical journals on bone biology, and I do hope to continue that.
If someone's listening to this and is really questioning, maybe even going to higher ed anymore, are there certain institutions they think are doing a better job than others that are on your radar about keeping, for lack of a better term, politics in a more neutral stance? A private or public universities or even alternative universities. Like I think there's one that just started in Austin,
Right.
Texas.
Yeah. I I think it's hard to say. You know, it really depends on what you want to study. For example, the University of Austin, it looks very interesting, but it doesn't have a lot of majors yet, right? I don't know how they're going to go about getting like real resources for, if you want to study astronomy, right? For example, that's hard to say. I am hesitant to tell people not to go to college because in many ways you learn so much. If you can bolster yourself up not to just be, count out into the political correctness or wokeness, you will still learn a lot. You'll learn, for example, the hard science aspects I think are still, still there. And, literature, you'll still, learn about, read interesting books and so forth. So I'm hesitant to say don't go to the university. And actually, my suggestion would be to go to the university that is close to you and cheap, because you don't want to be saddled with a huge bill at the end. But it's kind of interesting. I went to UC Santa Cruz as an undergraduate,
Banana,
and I taught.
is that the banana slugs?
Yes, that's the banana slugs. And I made my decision based on how beautiful I thought the campus was. And that's how I made my decision. And so I do think that, there are ways you're going to make, young people are going to make decisions that people may say, oh, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. You have to know yourself and make it. And I was very happy there. Taught at a Cal State system at San Jose State University. And one of the interesting things that I found out about the when teaching at San Jose State is that there's actually less difference between the universities than one might expect, and partly because many lecturers, so non-tenure track faculty, teach at the various institutions. So you might think, oh, I'm going to go to UC Berkeley. It has a really great reputation. Yet the same teacher who's teaching culture and warfare, whatever anthropology course it is, teaches the same course at San Jose State and maybe at a community college as well. And so you're just paying more money for the same class. And I feel confident in saying that those lecturers who teach across different universities, they're giving the same class. They're not creating 3 different classes. And so I do think that, there's no shame in making decisions based on finances.
I did notice, speaking of homeschooling, that you actually wrote a paper or an article in favor of homeschooling. Did this experience change your views of that, or was that something that you were already somewhat interested in?
I was homeschooled for some of my years, and I'm the youngest of 4. And all of us had been homeschooled at certain points in our K through 12 years. And how my parents did it was they said, if you don't want to go to school, you don't have to. You can be homeschooled. And they came to this decision because my oldest brother, who's 10 years older than me, when my family, my dad's retired Army, and my dad was stationed in Turkey, in the like 75 to 76 or 76 to 77, around that time. So I don't remember it. I was too young. And when they got to Turkey, my oldest brother, who would have been in school, there was no space for him at the English language school. And so they advised my parents to homeschool him for the year. And they did. And then when he got to the point where he was going to re-enter school, they tested him and he skipped not one grade, but two grades. And so after that experience, my parents always thought, we don't have to worry about our kids if they're homeschooled, they'll do fine. And they were right. I'm not saying that this is true for every kid or every family, but for my family, it was a joy to go to be homeschooled. And it was also a thing that was really not put upon us, but if we were unhappy in school, and it might not have even been unhappiness, it might have just been like, you know what, I really just want to stay home this year, then we were allowed to. And my parents did this even in times when homeschooling was illegal in the state where we were. My mother just said when the school board called, she just said, yeah, we're about to move because my dad was in the army. So even if we were there another year or two, that's just how she dealt with it. What I loved about homeschooling is that you had the freedom to go at your own pace. And so, like, I'm a very fast reader, and so I would read a lot. You had the freedom um, to focus on certain things that maybe you wouldn't have gotten to focus on. But every time I went back to school, so I had like periods where when I was in school, then homeschooled, then went back to school, and so mine wasn't consistent. Um, I never had trouble going back to school, and neither did my siblings. And so I think that actually shows a kind of resilience. And we always had friends, even when we were homeschooled. I do worry about people who homeschool their kids and they kids are not having a social life, because social life is important, but it's not the only school is not the only way to have a social life. There are other ways.
Yeah,
Um,
and even homeschooling has evolved so much from what
yeah,
I still encounter people who think homeschooling is this like either ultra hippie or ultra conservative
right.
mindset of
My
like
parents,
very cloistered environment where it's just in the home and you're kind of on a homestead type deal. Like
yeah,
the homeschooling in my area is almost entirely co-op. So you are in somewhat of a class environment, just you just move one location to the next throughout the week. And so there's one co-op in town that has like 100 kids. Like it's
yeah, and
huge.
it
They
just
have their own
varies.
classrooms.
And like in some ways, you could even say that I wasn't even homeschooled, I was unschooled. My mother was like, if they're reading and doing, things that they consider, that my parents considered work, like, math activity books and so forth, then my parents were happy. But we were all of us were like really self-motivated. And so, and you know, I'm the youngest. My brother, my so there's my oldest brother who's 10 years older than me, but then I have another brother. He is a PhD, and he is the director of the African Ape Center at Lincoln Park Zoo. And he would prior to that, he was at the University of Edinburgh for like 20 years. So like, I mean, obviously homeschooling didn't hurt his ability. And my sister's, and don't hold this against her, she's an associate dean at a university. So she's an English PhD, but she is an administrator now. um, but so we've all done well. And I think that, I'm not saying that we wouldn't have done as well had we not been homeschooled, but we definitely did well, and homeschooling didn't harm us. I do worry about students who are really in very indoctrinated schools where there's like a huge amount of indoctrination. Um, then that might be an area where you want to ask your kid, how are you feeling about these things? And
Yeah,
the
I
other
think
thing is,
and with COVID having stressed the school system so much, I find that there's actually a lot of also startup startup private schools on a
Yeah.
range from secular to super liberal and artsy to conservative, religious-ish, or even very religiously conservative, that you can still send your kid to a classroom environment. There's not public versus rich private versus homeschool. Now there's
Yeah.
kind of more of a chart range
Yeah, there's
of stuff.
there's a lot of choice, and I think that school choice is a very good thing. COVID shutting down the schools, I think, made people see that their school choice was actually a good thing. But unfortunately, shutting down the schools also, and it, resulted in some kids who really do need school to get away from like terrible home lives. I mean, I had a great home life, so, but like if you're in an abusive family, school can be a respite, right? So I think that it's very, very important to realize that there's a huge amount of variation, and there's one size doesn't fit all.
Well, Dr. Weiss, thank you so much for coming on this episode of Church Coffee. We'll see everyone next week. And if you're looking for any of the stuff mentioned by Dr. Weiss, I'll link her website and some articles and her books down below. So if you're interested, please give those a check. And we'll see everyone next week on Church Coffee.
Thank you so much.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.